It started as an ordinary Wednesday night at Charlie's taproom, the kind of night where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. The bar was alive with its usual energy. The dim, amber lights gave everything a warm glow, while the low hum of laughter and clinking glasses created a backdrop of familiarity. Regulars claimed their favorite seats, chatting about their days or debating the latest sports scores. Office workers, still in their business attire, gathered around tables, trying to shake off the stress of the day with rounds of beer and shared stories. The jukebox played soft rock, a tune that everyone knew but no one really paid attention to. Behind the counter, Jake, the bartender, moved like a machine. He was quick, efficient, and confident, maybe too confident. Jake had worked at Charlie's for years and had become the sort of bartender who could mix a drink while throwing a sarcastic comment at a customer, all without missing a beat. His sharp tongue was almost as famous as the bar's signature cocktails, and he thrived on the attention it brought him. The door to the bar creaked open, letting in a brief gust of cool evening air. Heads turned briefly before returning to their conversations. Jake barely looked up as a man stepped inside. The man walked slowly, his steps careful and deliberate. He wore simple clothes, a jacket and jeans, and held a white cane in one hand. He paused just inside the entrance, listening to the sounds around him before moving toward the bar. Jake noticed him but didn't bother to greet him. The man reached the bar, his free hand brushing against the edge as he found an empty stool and sat down. He rested his cane against the counter, its polished handle catching the light. "What'll it be?" Jake asked, his tone flat and uninterested. The man turned slightly toward Jake, his movements calm. "Could you read me the menu?" "I can't see it." Jake smirked, though he knew the man couldn't see his expression. He tossed a menu onto the counter, the laminated pages sliding just out of reach of the man's hand. "It's right there in front of you," Jake said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The man's hand moved across the counter, feeling for the menu. When he didn't find it, he sighed softly but said nothing. Across the room, in a shadowy corner booth, another man watched the exchange. He sat alone, a glass of water in front of him. His clothes were casual dark jeans and a hoodie, but there was something about him that seemed out of place, something that made him hard to ignore once you noticed him. But no one had noticed him yet. He watched the blind man carefully, his gaze steady and intense. His fingers tapped lightly on the table, not out of impatience but as if he were deep in thought. Back at the bar, the blind man finally found the menu, his fingers brushing against the slick surface. He picked it up, tilting his head slightly as if trying to imagine the words printed on the page. "I still can't read it," he said calmly. "Could you help me out?" Jake rolled his eyes, glancing at the other customers as if looking for sympathy. "Sure," he said, his tone exaggerated. "We've got beer, whiskey, and soda. Take your pick." A few people at nearby tables chuckled quietly, and Jake smirked, feeling validated. The blind man didn't react. He simply placed the menu back on the counter and said, "I'll have a soda, then." "Thank you." Jake poured the soda with minimal effort, sliding the glass across the counter. Some of the drink spilled over the edge, but Jake didn't bother to clean it up. The man reached for the glass, his fingers finding the sticky rim. He wiped his hand on his jeans and took a sip. In the corner booth, the observer's gaze hardened. He leaned back slightly, his eyes still fixed on the bar. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet focus that seemed to suggest he was waiting for something. Meanwhile, Jake had moved on, chatting with a group of regulars who laughed at his every joke. The blind man sat silently, his hands resting on the counter. He didn't seem upset, but there was a weight to his stillness, a quiet dignity that made it clear he wasn't as unaware as Jake might have thought. The man in the corner took a sip of his water, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed a subtle change in the room's atmosphere. Conversations quieted just a bit, as if the other patrons were starting to sense that something wasn't quite right. But Jake, oblivious as ever, continued his performance behind the bar, basking in the small spotlight he had created for himself. He didn't realize that the most important person in the room wasn't sitting at the bar or even watching him. That person was quietly waiting in the corner, unnoticed but fully aware of everything happening around him. What Jake didn't realize, and what no one else in the bar could have guessed, was that this seemingly ordinary night at Charlie's taproom was about to take a turn no one would forget. The blind man wasn't alone, and the man in the corner wasn't just any other customer. Together, they were about to change the course of Jake's night and maybe his life in ways he couldn't possibly see coming. The blind man adjusted his position on the stool, his cane resting against his leg. His demeanor remained calm, almost unshaken, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. It was as though he could sense the quiet amusement from some of the other patrons and the indifference from Jake. He didn't react outwardly, but his hands rested purposefully on the counter, his fingers lightly tapping the surface. Jake, busy with another group at the far end of the bar, didn't spare the blind man a second glance. Instead, he was too caught up entertaining his regulars, relishing their laughter at his dry jokes and sarcastic commentary. To him, this was just another night, another chance to play the center of attention. The blind man took another sip of his soda, the rim still slightly sticky from the earlier spill. He didn't flinch, nor did he complain. He simply placed the glass down, tilting his head slightly as though listening to the rhythm of the bar, the shuffling of feet, the occasional bursts of laughter, and Jake's booming voice cutting through it all. Across the room, the man in the corner booth sat motionless. He sipped his water quietly, his hoodie casting a faint shadow over his face. He wasn't a regular at Charlie's taproom, and no one had noticed him when he walked in earlier. That suited him just fine. But his gaze remained fixed on the bar, unwavering in its intensity. There was no malice in his eyes, just a quiet curiosity that seemed to grow with every passing second. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, the movement almost imperceptible but deliberate, as though marking time. Jake's voice rang out again, louder this time, drawing attention back to him. "So, what's the story, pal?" he asked, glancing toward the blind man. His tone was casual, but the smirk tugging at his lips gave him away. "How'd you end up in here tonight? Got someone guiding you around, or are you just wandering solo?" The blind man turned his head slightly, his expression calm but unreadable. He seemed to consider Jake's question for a moment before answering. "I came in for a drink," he said simply, his tone measured and polite. "Same as everyone else." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Fair enough," he said, clearly uninterested in the response. He turned back to his regulars, muttering something under his breath that drew a few more chuckles. The blind man sat silently, his hands folded neatly on the counter. He didn't look frustrated or angry. If anything, he seemed oddly at peace, as though he'd seen this kind of behavior before and knew exactly how to handle it. The man in the corner shifted slightly in his seat, his expression tightening. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, as if bracing himself for what might come next. Meanwhile, Jake continued his performance, juggling drink orders and cracking jokes with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. To him, the blind man was just another face in the crowd, someone who didn't demand attention, someone who could be easily overlooked. But the other patrons were starting to notice the blind man's quiet presence. A few glanced over at him, their expressions curious but hesitant. One or two whispered among themselves, their voices barely audible above the noise of the bar. Jake didn't seem to care. To him, the blind man wasn't worth the effort. He was more focused on the group of regulars at the end of the bar, their laughter fueling his ego. The blind man reached for his soda again, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He took another sip, the faintest hint of a smile crossing his lips. Then, he spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "You must really enjoy this job," he said, his tone carrying a hint of something unspoken. Jake turned toward him, his brow furrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his tone defensive. The blind man tilted his head slightly, his smile barely visible. "You seem to enjoy entertaining people," he said. "It's a good skill to have." Jake hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the comment. Then he shrugged, flashing his trademark smirk. "What can I say? People love me." The blind man nodded slowly, as though considering Jake's words. "I'm sure they do," he said, his voice even. Across the room, the man in the corner booth leaned back in his seat, his gaze narrowing slightly. His fingers stopped drumming, and his posture shifted, as though he were preparing for something. Jake, oblivious to the growing tension, turned back to his regulars, eager to soak up more laughter and applause. But the atmosphere in the bar was beginning to change. It wasn't obvious not yet, but there was a subtle shift, a quiet energy that seemed to ripple through the room. Some of the patrons exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. The blind man sat quietly, his hands resting on the counter once more. He didn't seem bothered by Jake's behavior, nor did he seem interested in drawing attention to himself. But there was something in his stillness, something unspoken that hinted at a deeper strength, a quiet confidence that went unnoticed by most. And still, the man in the corner watched. Jake continued his routine, pouring drinks and tossing out sarcastic remarks like they were second nature. But every so often, his eyes flicked back to the blind man, a hint of unease creeping into his expression. The blind man, for his part, remained calm and composed. He took another sip of his soda, his movements smooth and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. The man in the corner finally moved, leaning forward slightly. His fingers brushed the edge of his glass, and his gaze sharpened. Something was about to happen. The room felt heavier now, the air charged with a tension that no one could quite place. Conversations grew quieter, and the laughter from Jake's regulars started to fade. The blind man placed his glass back on the counter, his hands folding neatly in front of him. He turned his head slightly, as though listening to something only he could hear. And then, he spoke, his voice calm but carrying a weight that cut through the noise of the bar. "Do you always treat your customers like this?" Jake froze, his smirk faltering for the first time that night. The blind man's request was simple and kind, but Jake's response turned it into a spectacle. "Menus are right there, buddy. What do you want me to do? Spoon-feed you?" The bartender's smirk stretched across his face like he had just delivered a punchline, expecting the world to applaud him for his cleverness. From a nearby table, a few half-hearted chuckles arose, people unsure whether to laugh or cringe. Jake basked in their awkward approval, leaning against the bar like he had just stolen the spotlight. The blind man, however, didn't flinch. His fingers brushed the counter's edge, tracing its scratches and nicks. He let out a soft sigh, his expression calm but distant. "All right," he said quietly, his voice carrying a trace of something unshakable. "Just a soda, please." Jake grabbed a glass without looking, filling it with minimal effort. The carbonation hissed loudly as he poured, and the drink foamed over slightly. With an unnecessary show of indifference, he slammed the glass onto the counter, sending a few drops spilling onto the sticky wood. "Here," Jake muttered, not even bothering to wipe the mess. The blind man reached forward carefully, his fingers searching for the glass. His hand landed on its sticky rim, and he paused briefly before lifting it. He didn't complain, nor did he react to the dismissive service. He simply took a sip, his movements slow and deliberate. Across the room, the man in the corner booth remained perfectly still, his water untouched. The hood of his sweatshirt cast a shadow over his face, but his eyes never wavered from the scene unfolding at the bar. If anyone had bothered to look his way, they might have noticed the tension in his posture, the way his hands rested lightly on the table, ready for action. But no one noticed. All eyes were on Jake and his sharp tongue or carefully avoiding the situation altogether. Jake, sensing the lack of pushback from the blind man, decided to keep going. Emboldened by the silence, he leaned closer. "So," he said, dragging out the word. "You always roll into bars like this? Or is tonight special?" The blind man tilted his head slightly, as though listening to something Jake couldn't hear. His expression didn't change. "I didn't realize needing a drink was special," he replied evenly. The bartender chuckled, looking over his shoulder at the regulars. "Hey, Frank," Jake called out to a man at the end of the bar, "guess we've got a philosopher here tonight." Frank, a burly man with a thick mustache, chuckled along, though his laugh lacked enthusiasm. "Guess so, Jake," he said, more out of habit than agreement. The blind man took another sip of his soda, setting the glass down with care. "I didn't mean to interrupt your routine," he said. His voice was calm, but the words carried a quiet weight that hung in the air. Jake frowned slightly, the comment striking a nerve he didn't expect. He straightened up, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Don't worry about it," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Not every day we get someone like you in here. Keeps things interesting." The blind man remained silent, his hands resting on the counter as though anchoring him to the moment. Meanwhile, the man in the corner booth shifted slightly, leaning forward just enough to bring his face partially into the light. His jaw tightened, and his gaze sharpened. The room's atmosphere had changed, though most patrons were too wrapped up in their own conversations to notice. A young woman sitting at a nearby table glanced nervously at the bar, her eyes flickering between Jake and the blind man. She opened her mouth as if to say something but hesitated. Her companion, a middle-aged man with graying hair, placed a hand on her arm and shook his head, silently urging her to stay out of it. Jake, oblivious to the growing discomfort around him, decided to push further. "So, what's the story?" he asked, leaning on the bar with exaggerated casualness. "How'd you end up, like that?" He gestured vaguely at the blind man's cane. The blind man's fingers tightened slightly around the glass, but his expression remained neutral. "Like what?" he asked, his tone betraying no emotion. Jake shrugged. He said, his voice carrying an air of mock innocence. "Blind." A few gasps escaped from the quieter corners of the bar, but no one spoke up. Jake either didn't notice or didn't care. He was too caught up in the moment, too focused on maintaining his position as the self-proclaimed star of the show. The blind man turned his head slightly, his unseeing eyes seeming to search for Jake's face. "Does it matter?" he asked quietly. Jake scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Just making conversation," he said. "Trying to keep things lively." The man in the corner booth exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. He reached for his glass of water but didn't drink, his eyes locked on the bartender. The blind man reached for his cane, his fingers brushing against its polished surface. He tilted his head again, as though considering something. "You must think you're very funny," he said, his tone even but pointed. Jake's smirk widened, mistaking the comment for a compliment. "What can I say?" he replied, spreading his arms theatrically. "It's a gift." The blind man nodded slowly. "A gift," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The tension in the room was palpable now, an almost physical presence that pressed against everyone inside. Conversations had slowed to murmurs, and more patrons were turning their attention to the bar. Jake, still oblivious, leaned closer. "Hey, lighten up," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I'm just messing with you." The blind man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his glass and finished the last of his soda. He set it down carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Thank you for the drink," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "I think I'll leave now." Jake raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering slightly. "That's it?" he asked. "No witty comeback? No parting shot?" The blind man stood slowly, his cane in hand. He paused for a moment, his head tilted as if listening to the room one last time. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "silence speaks louder than words." With that, he turned and began walking toward the door, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. The man in the corner booth shifted again, this time standing slowly. His movements were unhurried but deliberate, his presence suddenly impossible to ignore. Jake, noticing the movement for the first time, frowned. "Hey, buddy," he called out, his tone more uncertain than before. "What's your deal?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he walked toward the bar, his steps steady and purposeful. The entire bar seemed to hold its breath, the tension reaching its breaking point. Something was about to happen, and everyone could feel it. The bar was no longer buzzing with chatter. Conversations fizzled out as patrons turned their attention to the unfolding scene. The blind man's quiet dignity seemed to ripple through the room, contrasting sharply with Jake's flippant arrogance. Jake watched the blind man's retreating figure for a moment, something like confusion flickering across his face. He wasn't used to being ignored. People usually either laughed along with him or confronted him. This man had done neither. But before Jake could think of another quip, the figure from the corner booth approached. His steps were deliberate, his hood still casting a shadow over his face. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor echoed in the sudden stillness of the bar. "Hey, pal," Jake called out, forcing a grin to cover his unease. "What's with the dramatic walk? You know the blind guy or something?" The man didn't answer immediately. He reached the bar and stood there, still and imposing. Slowly, he lowered his hood, revealing a face that was calm but unreadable. His eyes were sharp, scanning Jake with an intensity that made the bartender shift uncomfortably. "I do know him," the man said at last, his voice low but carrying a weight that cut through the silence. "And I don't think he appreciated the way you treated him." Jake's grin faltered. He straightened up, trying to regain his usual bravado. "Look, buddy, it's a bar. We joke around here. No harm, no foul." The man leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the bar. "It's not a joke if the other person isn't laughing," he said. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Jake swallow hard. Some of the patrons exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. This wasn't just a passing confrontation, it felt like something bigger was about to unfold. Jake laughed nervously, waving a hand. "Relax, man. You're taking this way too seriously." The guy didn't even seem upset. "He wasn't upset," the man replied. "But that doesn't make what you did any less wrong." Jake's expression hardened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in his domain. "Listen," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I run this bar, okay? I don't need some stranger telling me how to do my job." The man's gaze didn't waver. "And I don't need to tell you how to do your job. But maybe someone should remind you how to treat people with respect." A murmur ran through the bar. Some patrons nodded subtly, as if agreeing with the man's words but unwilling to say so out loud. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure where this was going. Jake slammed a hand on the counter, his frustration boiling over. "All right, that's enough," he snapped. "If you've got a problem, you can leave. I don't need this in my bar." The man didn't flinch. He stood there, calm and resolute, his presence somehow filling the entire space. "You don't need this," he repeated softly. "But maybe you do need a lesson in humility." Jake laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "Oh, yeah. And you're the guy to teach me, huh?" The man tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Not me," he said. "But I think you'll learn soon enough." Before Jake could respond, the blind man's voice cut through the tension. "Is everything all right here?" Everyone turned to see the blind man standing just inside the door, his cane in one hand and his head tilted slightly as if listening to the room. The man at the bar turned to face him, his demeanor softening instantly. "Everything's fine," he said. "Just making sure our friend here understands the importance of respect." Jake rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath. "What is this, a life lesson seminar?" The blind man walked slowly toward the bar, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. When he reached the counter, he placed his free hand on it, his movements deliberate. "Jake," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I just wanted a drink, like anyone else." Jake opened his mouth to retort, but the blind man held up a hand, stopping him. "I've been to a lot of places," the blind man continued, "and I've met a lot of people. Some are kind. Some are indifferent. And some go out of their way to make life harder for no reason at all." Jake shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the words, but he crossed his arms, refusing to back down. "I could let it go," the blind man said. "I've let it go plenty of times before. But tonight, I think I'll say something." The room was silent, every eye fixed on the blind man. "You don't know me," he said. "And I don't know you. But what I do know is that how you treat people says a lot about who you are. And tonight, Jake, you showed everyone here exactly who you are." The words hung in the air like a challenge, impossible to ignore. Jake's face turned red, his jaw tightening. "You don't get to come in here and talk to me like that," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You think you're better than me just because you're playing the victim card." A collective gasp rippled through the bar. Even Jake's regulars looked uncomfortable now, their eyes darting between him and the blind man. The man from the corner booth stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Enough," he said, his tone firm. "You've said more than enough." Jake turned to face him, his frustration spilling over. "Who the hell are you, anyway?" he demanded. The man smiled faintly, his expression calm but knowing. "Someone who's seen more than you could imagine," he said. "And someone who knows that people like you always learn their lesson the hard way." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the blind man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. He placed it on the counter with deliberate precision. "What's that?" Jake asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "A complaint card." The blind man smiled faintly. "Something like that," he said. Jake picked up the card and froze. His eyes widened as he read the name printed on it, the color draining from his face. Around the bar, whispers started to spread as people leaned in, trying to catch a glimpse of what had left Jake speechless. The blind man turned to the man from the corner booth, a knowing smile on his lips. "Shall we?" he asked. The other man nodded, his expression unreadable. Together, they began to walk toward the door, leaving the bar in stunned silence. Jake stood frozen behind the counter, the card still clutched in his hand. Whatever he had seen, it had shaken him to his core. As the door closed behind the two men, the bar erupted into hushed murmurs. People speculated, their curiosity ignited by the sudden shift in power. But Jake said nothing. He just stared at the card, his hands trembling slightly. What had he just done? And who, exactly, had he just crossed? The whispers spread like wildfire across the bar. Conversations halted mid-sentence, chairs creaked as people leaned closer to one another, and all eyes turned toward the man from the corner booth. Jake squinted at him, his irritation barely masking his confusion. "What now?" he asked, his voice rising. "You got something to say too, buddy?" The man from the corner stepped forward, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Jake's growing agitation. He wore no suit, no flashy watch, nothing that screamed power. And yet, As he moved, there was an unmistakable authority about him. It wasn't his clothes, or even the way he walked, it was the way the room seemed to shift, as though gravity itself had tilted in his direction. The whispers grew louder. "I swear that's him, no way. What would he be doing here? Jake has no idea what he's just done." The blind man stayed quiet, his fingers lightly drumming against the bar. That serene, knowing smile remained on his face, as if he was waiting for something. Jake's unease deepened as the man from the corner stopped a few feet away from him. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. His bravado was slipping, his usual air of dominance faltering under the weight of the stranger's silence. The man tilted his head, studying Jake with an almost clinical detachment. Then, he spoke. "Who I am isn't the question you should be asking," he said in a measured tone. "The better question is, what did you just reveal about yourself to everyone in this room?" Jake blinked, caught off guard by the cryptic response. He glanced around, noticing for the first time the way the crowd had shifted, how they were no longer laughing at his jokes, how their gazes were fixed on him, judgment in their eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake snapped, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I run this bar, and if people don't like it, they can leave." The man smiled faintly, the kind of smile that wasn't born of humor but of certainty. "You think running a bar gives you the right to treat people however you like?" he asked, his voice quiet but carrying through the room. "Do you think belittling others makes you strong?" Jake opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, a woman near the back of the bar chimed in. "He's right, you know. You've been doing this for years, Jake. Acting like you're better than everyone else just because you're behind the bar." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jake's face reddened, his frustration boiling over. "Oh, so now you're all against me," he said, slamming a glass onto the counter. "You've all been coming here for years, laughing at my jokes. But now, because some random guy decides to make a scene, suddenly I'm the bad guy." The blind man chuckled softly, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. "It's not about one moment, Jake," he said. "It's about a pattern. A habit. And tonight, you happen to pick the wrong people to underestimate." Jake stared at him, his confusion giving way to anger. "Oh yeah? And who are you, exactly?" "Some guy who thinks he's smarter than me because he can throw around fancy words." The blind man turned his head slightly toward the stranger from the corner, as if inviting him to respond. But the man from the corner simply crossed his arms, watching with an unreadable expression. Instead, it was a patron near the bar who broke the silence. "Jake, do you even know who you're talking to?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Jake scoffed. "What, are they celebrities or something? Should I be asking for an autograph?" Another patron chimed in, his tone hushed but urgent. "You don't recognize him? That's Mark." "SHH, someone else hissed, cutting him off. But it was too late. Jake's laughter faltered. He blinked, glancing back at the man from the corner. "Mark," he repeated, his voice uncertain. "Mark who?" The room seemed to hold its breath. The man from the corner didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black wallet. He opened it slowly, deliberately, and placed a sleek black card onto the bar counter. Jake leaned forward to look at it. His eyes widened as he recognized the minimalist design, the iconic logo embossed in silver. The whispers around the room turned into a low hum of shock and awe. "No way," someone muttered. "It really is him." Jake's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You're not," he stammered, his bravado crumbling. "I mean, you can't be." The blind man chuckled again, this time louder. "Funny how quickly people change their tune when they realize they've been barking up the wrong tree," he said. Mark, because now there was no doubt who he was, tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. I didn't come here to be recognized, he said calmly. I came here to observe. To see how people like you treat others when you think no one's watching. Jake's face turned crimson. Look, I didn't mean anything by it, he said quickly, his voice trembling. I was just joking around. I didn't know. And that's the problem, Mark interrupted, his tone sharp. You didn't know. You didn't care to know. You assumed. And your assumptions led you to disrespect someone you had no right to disrespect. The blind man tapped his cane lightly against the floor. Don't blame him too much, he said, his tone light but pointed. Some people only see what they want to see. The bar was silent again, every patron riveted by the unfolding scene. Jake looked around, desperate for someone to come to his defense. But no one did. Even the regulars who had laughed at his jokes now sat quietly, their expressions unreadable. Mark stepped closer to the bar, his presence looming. You should think about what kind of environment you're creating here, Jake, he said. Because it's not just about one bad night. It's about the culture you're building. And if you keep this up, it won't just be me walking out that door. With that, he turned to the blind man. Shall we? He asked, his voice gentle. The blind man nodded, rising slowly from his stool. Together, they began to walk toward the door, leaving behind a room full of stunned faces. Jake stood frozen behind the bar, his hands gripping the counter. He looked down at the sleek black card again, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. And for the first time in years, he was at a loss for words. The door swung shut behind Mark and the blind man, leaving a vacuum in the room. The whispers surged louder, filling the void like a dam had broken. That was him, wasn't it? Did you see the card? That's not something just anyone carries. What's a guy like that doing here? Jake's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the bar. He stared at the glossy black card left behind, the faint logo catching the light. His breathing quickened, and the bravado he'd wielded moments ago was now a distant memory. Finally, one of the regulars, an older man named Hank, spoke up from his corner stool. You've really done it this time, Jake. Jake snapped his head toward Hank, his voice shaky but defensive. What are you talking about? It was just some guy and his blind friend. How was I supposed to know who they were? Hank leaned back, shaking his head slowly. Does it matter who they were? You don't treat people like that, Jake. You've been walking all over folks for years. Tonight, you just happened to mess with the wrong ones. Jake's face darkened. Oh, come on, Hank. Don't start with the high and mighty act. You've laughed at my jokes for years. Yeah, I did, Hank admitted. And I'm not proud of it. But there's a difference between cracking jokes and tearing people down for sport. Jake opened his mouth to retort, but another voice interrupted. You're lucky they didn't call you out worse than they did. The voice belonged to Clara, a middle-aged woman sitting with a group of co-workers at a table near the bar. She rarely spoke up, but tonight, her voice carried. Jake sneered. Oh, great. Now everyone's against me. That's rich. Clara folded her arms, unfazed by his defensiveness. It's not about being against you, Jake. It's about calling out what's wrong. That blind man didn't deserve the way you treated him. None of us did. The murmur of agreement around the room grew louder, each voice adding weight to the atmosphere pressing down on Jake. I didn't mean anything by it. Jake snapped, his frustration boiling over. It's just how I run things around here. People like it, don't they? They keep coming back. Maybe, Clara said sharply. But have you ever stopped to wonder why? Maybe it's not because of you, Jake. Maybe it's in spite of you. Jake flinched as if the words were a physical blow. He glanced around the room, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for anyone to back him up. But the usual allies stayed quiet, their gazes either fixed on their drinks or locked onto him with something new, disappointment. "Fine," Jake said finally, his voice brittle. "You all want to gang up on me now? Go ahead. But don't act like you're better than me. You've all laughed along for years. Don't pretend you're saints now." Another voice rose from the crowd. It was Sam, a quiet man who usually kept to himself in the corner. "Jake, maybe it's not about pretending to be saints. Maybe it's about finally speaking up." Jake's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked smaller than he ever had behind that bar. He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration giving way to something closer to fear. "What am I supposed to do now, huh?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Hank spoke again, his tone softer this time. "Start by taking a good, hard look at yourself, Jake. And maybe just maybe you'll figure it out before it's too late." Outside, Mark and the blind man walked down the quiet street, the cool night air brushing against their faces. "You handled that well," the blind man said, a hint of amusement in his voice. Mark shrugged, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Sometimes people need to be reminded of the power of their choices. Even if they don't want to hear it." The blind man chuckled. "You think he'll actually change?" Mark was quiet for a moment before replying. "I don't know. But he's going to think about tonight for a long time. And that's a start." They reached a sleek black car parked at the curb. A driver stepped out, opening the door for them. As the blind man climbed in, he paused and turned his head toward Mark. "Do you ever get tired of doing this?" Mark smiled faintly. "Of reminding people that the way they treat others matters? No. It's what keeps me grounded." The blind man nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. They both climbed into the car, and moments later, it disappeared into the night, leaving the bar and its bartender to grapple with the echoes of their actions. Back inside Charlie's taproom, the atmosphere remained tense. Jake stood behind the counter, his mind racing. For the first time, he wasn't the one holding the room's attention. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted it. He stared down at the card on the bar, its weight far heavier than its size suggested. Finally, with trembling hands, he slipped it into his pocket, unsure what to do next. The patrons began to return to their drinks, though the energy in the room was far from relaxed. Whispers continued to circulate, speculating on the identities of the two strangers and what might happen next. As Jake cleaned a glass with shaky hands, Hank spoke up one last time. "You've got a choice to make, Jake," he said. "You can keep pretending tonight didn't happen. Or you can take it as the wake-up call it is." Jake didn't respond. He just kept cleaning, his mind a storm of questions, doubts, and fears. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure: nothing about Charlie's taproom or himself would ever be the same again. The room went silent, every pair of eyes fixed on Mark and the blind man. Jake's breath hitched as the gravity of the situation began to settle in. His earlier bravado felt like a distant memory, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Mark stepped closer, his usually composed face now set in a stern glare. "You see, Jake, it's easy to judge someone based on what you see or think you see. But what you've just demonstrated isn't strength. It's weakness." Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. I didn't mean any harm. I didn't know." "That's the problem," Mark interrupted sharply. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You saw someone who needed help, and instead of showing kindness, you chose mockery." The blind man tilted his head slightly, the faintest smile playing on his lips. "It's a common theme, really. Some people see blindness as a limitation when, in fact, the real blindness lies in their inability to look past their own biases. The patrons murmured in agreement. Whispers like "serves him right" and "about time someone called him out" filled the room. Jake could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him, suffocating and inescapable. Mark glanced around the bar, his voice cutting through the whispers. "Do you know why I'm here tonight? Why someone like me, with no shortage of choices, walked into a place like this?" Nobody answered. Even Jake stood frozen, his mind racing but coming up blank. "I came because I believe in seeing things as they are," Mark continued. "Not through the lens of polished presentations or curated experiences, but raw and unfiltered. This place was supposed to be a test, an ordinary setting to observe extraordinary truths. And what I saw tonight," he paused, his eyes locking onto Jake, "is a culture of arrogance and disrespect." Jake's lips trembled as he attempted to speak. I've run this place for years. People come back. They laugh at my jokes. It's just how things are." Mark shook his head. "People don't come back because of you, Jake. They come back because of familiarity. Because it's easier to accept something flawed than to challenge it. But that doesn't make it right." The blind man turned toward Jake, his voice calm but firm. "And here's the thing about familiarity: it only takes one moment to shatter it. Tonight might just be that moment for you." Jake opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. He felt like a caged animal, exposed and cornered with nowhere to turn. The bar he had always controlled now felt alien, its energy transformed in a way he couldn't grasp. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek card. He placed it on the bar and slid it toward Jake. "That's the number of someone who can help you reevaluate how you run this place," he said. "Consider it a lifeline. Use it or don't. But know this, change isn't optional. It's inevitable. And it's better to embrace it than to be forced into it." Jake stared at the card, his fingers twitching. He didn't dare pick it up yet. The blind man added softly, "It's not about punishment, Jake. It's about growth. What you choose to do next will define not just your bar, but you." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air as Mark turned to leave. He nodded at the blind man, who tapped his cane against the floor and began to follow. Together, they walked toward the door, their steps slow but resolute. Just before they exited, Mark paused and turned back, his eyes meeting Jake's one final time. "And Jake? People like you often underestimate the quiet ones. Don't make that mistake again." With that, the door swung shut, leaving Jake to confront the silence that followed. The bar patrons, who had been spectators to his downfall, resumed their conversations, though now with a tone of subdued reflection rather than revelry. Jake slumped against the bar, his hands trembling. He stared at the card Mark had left behind, its glossy surface catching the dim light. Around him, the bar seemed smaller, its once familiar walls closing in like a prison. Clara, the woman who had spoken up earlier, walked to the counter. "Jake," she said quietly, "you've got a lot to think about. But you've also got a chance to fix this. Don't waste it." Hank chimed in from his corner. "It's not too late, kid. But if you keep going down this path, it soon will be." Jake didn't respond. He just nodded slowly, his mind a whirlwind of shame, regret, and a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, hope. Mark and the blind man walked down the quiet street, their breath visible in the cool night air. "You think he'll actually change?" the blind man asked, his tone light but curious. Mark smiled faintly. "That's up to him." But tonight, he was forced to see himself in a way he never had before. Sometimes, that's all it takes to start a transformation. The blind man chuckled. "And what if it doesn't? What if he goes back to his old ways?" Mark shrugged. "Then at least he'll know the choice was his. You can't force someone to grow, but you can show them the mirror." The blind man nodded, his expression thoughtful. Together, they continued walking, their silhouettes fading into the night, leaving behind a bar forever changed. Here's the continuation, expanding on the fallout of the reveal, deepening Jake's internal conflict, and adding layers to the bar's atmosphere and its patrons' responses. Jake stared blankly at the card on the counter, the name and contact details etched into his mind. It seemed to burn under the dim bar lights, a physical manifestation of his shame. He wanted to crush it, toss it away, pretend this night had never happened. But he couldn't. The weight of everyone's eyes, real or imagined, held him in place. He looked up, scanning the room. The once friendly faces of regulars now seemed alien. Their expressions ranged from pity to disdain, with a few nodding in silent judgment. Clara hadn't returned to her table. She stood by the bar, arms folded, watching him closely. "Jake," she said, breaking the silence that had stretched unbearably thin. "You're not the first person to make a mistake. But the question is, will you be the kind who learns from it?" Jake flinched, her words cutting deeper than any insult. He had no retort this time, no snarky comeback to deflect the moment. "I didn't know who he was," he muttered finally, his voice small, almost pleading. Clara sighed. "It's not about who he was, Jake. It's about who you are. Or maybe who you've become." As the bar settled back into an uneasy murmur, Jake found himself trapped in his own thoughts. The realization hit him like a freight train: it wasn't just about tonight. This wasn't an isolated moment of bad judgment. It was the culmination of years spent hiding behind sarcasm and power plays, using cruelty as a shield for his own insecurities. Memories surfaced: unbidden cutting remarks to customers who didn't tip well, dismissive comments to new employees who were too nervous to respond, even the way he'd brushed off Clara's complaints about his behavior months ago. Back then, he'd chalked it up to running a business his way. But now, it all felt like excuses. Weak ones at that. Jake ran a hand over his face, his fingers shaking. "I remember when this place wasn't like this," Hank said suddenly, his voice carrying across the bar. All heads turned toward him, including Jake's. "What do you mean?" someone asked, a younger man seated at the far end. Hank leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bar. His gaze didn't leave Jake. "Charlie," he was the original owner, used to say this bar was a home for everyone. Didn't matter where you came from or what your story was. You walked through those doors, and you were treated like family." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. "I used to come here after tough days," Hank continued. "Charlie never judged. He'd pour you a drink, listen if you wanted to talk, and leave you alone if you didn't. This place felt safe." Jake looked away, guilt pricing his skin. He'd inherited Charlie's taproom when the old man retired, promising to keep the spirit alive. But somewhere along the way, that promise had been forgotten. "What happened?" Clara asked, though her question wasn't aimed at Hank. Her eyes were on Jake. Jake opened his mouth, but no words came out. He didn't have an answer, not one he wanted to say aloud. As the hours ticked on, the bar began to empty. The buzz from earlier had faded into a tense quiet. Patrons left in pairs or small groups, their whispered conversations a mix of shock and speculation. Jake busied himself wiping down the counter, though it was already clean. Anything to avoid the eyes of the remaining customers. The black card still lay there, untouched, daring him to confront it. Hank was one of the last to leave. He slid off his stool and walked toward the door, pausing just before he exited. "Jake," he called, his voice heavy with meaning. Jake looked up reluctantly. "Charlie believed in second chances," Hank said. "You should believe in them too, starting with yourself." And then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft thud. Clara was the only one left now. She hadn't moved from her spot by the bar, her drink untouched. Jake finally broke the silence. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice thick with exhaustion. Clara raised an eyebrow. Because I know you, Jake. Beneath all that bluster and bravado, there's someone who doesn't want to be the villain of this story. Jake laughed bitterly. Villain? That's dramatic. Is it? Clara shot back. You humiliated a blind man in front of a crowd of strangers. You mocked his disability. What would you call it? Jake winced, her words hitting their mark. I don't know, he admitted. I guess. I didn't think. It was just a joke. Clara leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent. Maybe it's time to start thinking, Jake. Because those jokes have consequences. Tonight, you got called out by one of the most powerful people in the world. But it shouldn't take someone like Mark Zuckerberg to make you realize how wrong you were. Jake nodded slowly, her words sinking in. What do I do now? He asked, his tone vulnerable in a way Clara had never heard before. She smiled faintly. Start with an apology. To yourself. To this place. And to everyone who's walked through those doors looking for comfort and found anything but. Jake glanced down at the card on the counter. For the first time, he picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The next morning, Jake arrived at the bar hours before opening. The light spilling through the windows illuminated the space in a way he'd never noticed before. It felt different. He sat at the counter, the card in front of him, and dialed the number. Hello, a professional voice answered. Jake hesitated, then took a deep breath. Hi. My name's Jake. I think I need some help. The door swung shut behind Mark and the blind man, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Jake stood frozen, staring at the spot where the two had just been. The card that Mark had slid across the bar sat there like a damning reminder of everything he had just done. His palms were sweaty, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of the bar's cooling system whirred loudly in the otherwise quiet space, but all Jake could hear was the rush of blood in his ears. The patrons, who had once found Jake's crude humor amusing, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down at their drinks, others exchanged quick glances, but none of them dared to make eye contact with Jake. He could feel their judgment in every passing second, a heavy weight pressing down on him from all sides. Clara, who had been watching from the corner of the bar, took a deep breath and walked over to him. She didn't say anything at first, she simply stood next to him, her arms crossed, waiting for Jake to speak. For a moment, Jake didn't move. His thoughts were a chaotic whirl of regret, frustration, and confusion. He'd been the one in control, the one who ran things here. He'd never imagined that his actions could lead to something like this, something that felt so final. But as he stood there, staring at the card that had the power to change everything, he realized that there was no going back. I didn't think, he muttered finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara exhaled sharply. No, you didn't. But you're going to think now, aren't you? Jake turned to look at her, his eyes wide with a mix of shame and uncertainty. What do I do now, Clara? How do I fix this? Clara's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. You start by admitting you were wrong. That's the first step. The second step is doing better, actually changing. You can't keep running this place like you're still the boss of the world. Jake nodded slowly, his throat tight. The weight of Clara's words was sinking in, and he knew she was right. He had to face this. He had to own up to it. The following morning, Jake was up before the sun. His hands shook as he made himself a cup of coffee, the steam rising from the mug in the quiet kitchen. The card from Mark sat on the counter, its sharp edges still pristine. He had barely slept, turning over the events of the previous night in his mind, playing out every word he'd said to the blind man, every cruel remark he'd thrown at him without a second thought. What had he been thinking? How could he have been so dismissive? Jake sighed heavily and reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, hesitating. He wanted to ignore it, pretend it didn't happen, but deep down, he knew that wasn't an option. With a shaky breath, he dialed the number on the card. The phone rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. "Hello, this is Alex. How can I help you?" Jake paused. "Hi. My name's Jake, and I was the bartender last night at Charlie's Tap Room. I made a mistake. A big one. I need to make it right." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "I'm listening," Alex said. Jake closed his eyes, taking a steadying breath. "I treated a customer terribly. A blind man, actually. I made jokes at his expense, and I was just awful to him. And I didn't realize who he was. He's someone important, someone who deserves respect. I need to fix this. I'm not proud of what I did, and I don't want to keep running the bar like this." Alex's voice was steady but warm. "Thank you for calling. It takes a lot to admit when you're wrong. I'll make sure the right people know, and we'll discuss how we can move forward." "But Jake, you're already doing the right thing by owning up to it. That's the first step." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't much, but it was something. He had taken the first step, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like he might be on the path to redemption. Later that day, Jake arrived at Charlie's Tap Room to open for the evening shift. The familiar sights of the bar, the worn wooden countertops, the neon signs flickering in the corner seemed different now. They felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who wasn't the man he had been yesterday. He took a deep breath and made his way behind the bar, his hands steady as he began to prepare for the evening. The usual setup felt strangely foreign, but it also felt like a clean slate. It was as if the bar itself had been waiting for him to make a change. By the time the first patrons started to trickle in, Jake was ready. He greeted them with a sincerity he hadn't shown in years, offering them a warm smile and making sure their drinks were served with genuine care. For the first time, he wasn't trying to be the funny guy or the tough guy behind the bar. He was simply there, present, attentive, and respectful. As the night wore on, Jake could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The usual tension had faded, replaced by an odd sense of ease. People were laughing, sure, but it wasn't the nervous, uncomfortable laughter from before. It was real. It was earned. At one point, Clara walked in, her eyes scanning the room before they landed on Jake. She raised an eyebrow and nodded in approval. "Good to see you actually doing it," she said with a smile. Jake grinned back, though his smile felt more genuine than it ever had before. "Yeah, I think I'm starting to get it." A few weeks later, the full impact of Jake's actions began to unfold. Mark's company had taken notice of the situation, and Jake had received a formal apology letter from them. The blind man whom Jake had learned was a top engineer had insisted that no further action be taken against him. But that didn't mean Jake had escaped unscathed. The bar had been under a microscope ever since the incident, and many patrons had voiced their concerns about the way Jake had treated customers. Some even refused to come back, unwilling to support a place that had allowed such behavior. But there was a silver lining. The changes Jake made to the bar, the way he now treated every customer with kindness and respect, slowly began to restore the reputation Charlie's Tap Room had once held. And just as Clara had predicted, Jake's transformation didn't go unnoticed. Word spread, and new customers began to fill the seats. The bar was still the same old Charlie's Tap Room, but it felt like a new chapter had begun, one where respect was the currency, and humor was no longer a tool for belittling others. A month later, Jake stood in front of the bar, looking at the familiar, worn sign above the door. He'd worked hard to rebuild not just the bar, but himself. As he surveyed the room, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had earned back the trust of his customers, and more importantly, he had earned his own respect. Clara walked in, as she often did now, with a smile on her face. "You've done it," she said, her voice filled with approval. Jake looked at her, his face softening with a genuine smile. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what it means to be a good person, Clara." And for the first time, Jake knew it wasn't just words. It was true. The night was winding down, and Charlie's taproom had quieted to a gentle hum. The last few customers sipped on their drinks, finishing up their conversations, while Jake stood behind the bar, wiping down the counter. It had been a long day, but it had also been one of the most rewarding. There was a sense of calm in the air, a peaceful satisfaction that Jake hadn't felt in a long time. As he worked, his thoughts drifted back to everything that had happened. He remembered the blind man, the way he had sat quietly at the bar, not asking for anything but respect. He remembered the arrogance that had blinded him, the cruelty that he had used to mask his own insecurities. But more than that, he remembered the lesson he had learned, the lesson that had changed everything. It wasn't just about what people could see or what they could do. It was about how you treated them, regardless of what they seemed to offer. It was about recognizing that everyone had a story, everyone had a reason for being there. The blind man had been no less important because of his disability. In fact, Jake had learned that night that those who seemed to have the least were often the ones with the most to offer, because they didn't need the approval of others to define their worth. Mark Zuckerberg's presence had been a stark reminder of that truth. The man hadn't walked in with fanfare or arrogance. He hadn't demanded attention. Instead, he had been quiet, observant, a calm force in the background. And yet, he had been the one to reveal the depth of the blind man's importance, not just as an engineer but as a person deserving of dignity. Jake had thought he was the one in control, but in reality, he had been the one who needed to learn. His whole life, he had measured worth by outward appearances, by status, wealth, or success. He had never understood that respect wasn't earned by position, it was earned by action. It wasn't about who you were on the outside, but who you were when no one was looking. Now, as Jake finished his shift, he felt something stirring within him, a quiet but undeniable shift in his perspective. He wasn't the same man who had arrogantly laughed at someone's expense just weeks ago. That man was gone, replaced by someone who understood the value of kindness, the weight of words, and the power of empathy. Sometimes, it wasn't about who you saw in the spotlight. It was about who was there, quietly watching in the background, waiting for you to realize their worth. And it was a humbling thought. The world was full of people who weren't noticed by everyone, but they were always watching. They were always observing how others treated them, how they were seen and understood. In the end, it wasn't the loudest voices that mattered. It was the quietest actions that spoke the most. The night felt different now, somehow. The bar seemed less like a place to drown out the noise of life and more like a space for real connection. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he belonged not just behind the bar, but in the world around him. He was part of something bigger now, something that didn't rely on jokes at others' expense or power over the weak. He took a step back and looked at the room one last time before locking up. A few regulars were still sitting at their tables, enjoying their drinks, chatting with each other. There was no tension in the air. No jokes at anyone's expense. Just people, simply being people. Jake smiled softly to himself. It wasn't perfect, not yet. But it was a start. And sometimes, that was all it took. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, the street lights casting long shadows along the sidewalk, Jake thought back to the words of the blind man that night. He had said it so simply, so calmly, it's always the loudest voices that carry the most insecurity. And Jake had believed it then, but now, he understood it in a way he hadn't before. The loudest voices were often just masks covering up fear, insecurity, and doubt. Those who were truly secure didn't need to shout. They didn't need to seek approval. They just existed, with quiet confidence, knowing that their worth was not tied to anyone else's opinion. The world, Jake realized, was full of invisible people who carried the weight of the world in silence. And sometimes, those were the people who could teach the biggest lessons. They didn't have the flashiest jobs or the most powerful titles, but they understood what mattered in life: respect. Simple, quiet, genuine respect. Jake paused at the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. The soft sound of traffic hummed in the distance, but it felt distant now. The noise of the world felt quieter. And for the first time in years, Jake felt at peace with himself. He thought of the blind man again. He thought about how easy it was to overlook someone, to dismiss them because they didn't fit into the mold of what society valued. But in the end, it wasn't about the way someone looked or what they could do for you. It was about how you treated them when no one was looking. And that was the true test of character. It wasn't about appearances. It wasn't about wealth, fame, or status. It was about how you saw others and how you made them feel, especially when you thought no one was watching. Mark Zuckerberg had given Jake a gift that night, though he didn't know it. He had shown him that there was more to life than being the loudest voice in the room. There was more to life than proving you were better than someone else. It was about being kind, about understanding that everyone, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with dignity. As Jake walked home that night, the stars above him seemed brighter, the world seemed a little quieter. And he knew that no matter where his journey took him, he would always remember the lesson the blind man had taught him, the lesson that it wasn't always about who you saw, but who was watching when you thought no one cared. Sometimes, the most important people were the ones who never made a sound. And sometimes, the biggest lesson came from the quietest moments. In the end, Jake learned that respect wasn't earned by what you could see, it was earned by what you could give. And in a world where appearances often deceive, where loud voices demand attention, it was the quiet, unnoticed ones who held the real power. The power to change hearts. The power to change minds. It wasn't always about being seen, it was about seeing others for who they truly were. And in that, Jake found his peace.